So verse 13 of Isaiah 52, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently, he shall be exalted and extolled, and be very high." This, I believe, is a summary of everything you're about to read. This one verse summarizes the rest of the passage about the servant. First, he's going to be a servant. He comes humbly. He comes in a slave-type matter, like Jesus says, "I did not come to be served, but to serve," and to offer his life a ransom for many. He comes to be a blessing and a service to all of us. He'll deal prudently, which means he will do what's necessary, what is needed, and this is desperately needed. Mankind needs forgiveness of sin. That's the issue that it deals with, as we already read. He'll do what is right, and then he comes, he serves, he does what's right, and then what happens? He's exalted, extolled, and very high. So he gets exalted, he gets lifted up. This is big talk, big words. Exalted, extolled, very high. I'm sort of saying this a similar thing three different ways to just get across the point that he will be glorified after this service. Then there's the glorification. And this sort of descent and ascent theology is throughout the New Testament. It's constantly in there. Philippians 2, right? That God, Jesus, he was in the form of God, but he did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. But instead, he made himself in the likeness of sinful flesh. He came, he humbled himself and became a servant. He was obedient even to the cross. And then what? And then because of that obedience, because of all that goodness, God exalted him and raised him up so that now every knee will bow to him. So we have this sort of descent, ascent, descent, ascent. In fact, this is what the Gospels record. The Gospels record the descent of Christ coming as a servant, serving, finally his death, that lowest point of service, and then his resurrection and ascension and glorification and exaltation. And so we have this constantly. Hebrews 1 talks about it. In fact, if you read Hebrews carefully, you'll see it's over and over in the book, this descent, ascent, descent, ascent. It's in that very consistently. So here it is. That's the summary in verse 13. And then in verse 14 it says, "Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." Pardon me. So they were astonished at you. People were astonished at Jesus. In fact, a fun thing to do is do a word search on your computer. Go up on blueletterbible.org or something like that, and you could do a concordance search where you type a word in, and it shows you every time that word is used in the Bible. Well, do a word search on the word astonished, and look at the times it's used just in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you see how they were constantly astonished at Jesus. It's like everywhere he walked, jaws were dropping. Like, wait, he said what? He did what? He said what? And they're just constantly impressed and surprised by him. It's very consistent. His teachings and his miracles, his actions are just constantly astonished by these things. But then also, the most astonishing thing was ultimately the crucifixion. The shocking thing, in fact, it connects it to that. They're astonished, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Now, this doesn't mean that Jesus was marred more than any other human who has ever lived on earth. I mean, if someone fell into a wood chipper, I imagine they were marred more, than Jesus was on the cross. What it means more than any man is, it means that when you looked upon him, you were like, what is that? What is that? There was so much swelling and tearing and ripping and all that going on in his body that it was difficult to identify what you were looking at. For a second, your eyes just were like, wait, I have a hard time looking at that because I'm not sure what to make of it. His visage was marred. He was beaten a minimum of 3 different times at different locations. He was beaten before Caiaphas, the high priest, where they beat him, they covered his face, and they punched him, which means that he couldn't see it coming, and a blow you can't see coming is, of course, the worst one. They took him before Herod, and in front of Herod, they beat him again. They just pounded on him and beat him. And then finally, he goes before the Romans, and he experiences the beating that we talked about previously, I think last week, when we talked about Psalm 22. And this vicious, vicious beating where he was not only physically beaten, but then also the flagellum and all this sort of tearing and ripping on his flesh. And they also, we get from other passages in Isaiah that the servant, as you read those other chapters, that was chapter 42, 49, 50, and 53, as you read those chapters, you'll see that his beard was ripped out of his face. And so his visage was marred. It was marred. That was a way of being hateful and disrespectful as well as just torturous. Verse 15, "So shall he sprinkle many nations." This phrase, sprinkle many nations, is incredibly biblically profound, but most often us Gentiles miss it. What on earth is sprinkling about in a biblical context? It's actually really neat. So when Moses first brought the people of Israel out of Egypt, they were given the law, the book of the law. They were told to construct the tabernacle. And then they went through a ceremony where he cleansed everything, purified everything, where he offered a bunch of sacrifices, took the blood, and he sprinkled the blood on everything. He sprinkled blood, just sprinkled it on the altar, on the book, on the tabernacle, on the people. And they were all covered, at least in some dots or whatever, up with blood. What is this about? Well, this is consistent throughout the law. This idea of getting sprinkled with blood, sprinkle blood on that, sprinkle blood this, sprinkle this. The idea is the blood is the sacrifice of the animal paying for my sins, and then the blood's put on me, as in that blood now covers me to deal with my sin. So to a Jewish mind, when you say that this person will be marred more than any man, and this is how he's going to do what? Sprinkle many nations. He's going to cover their sin with his blood. He's going to save them. He's going to offer them forgiveness through his sacrifice. This is so amazing because this is like advanced theology here in an ancient pre-Christ text. This is absolutely amazing. He will sprinkle many nations, and unlike Moses, he won't just sprinkle the Jews. He's going to have this impact on many nations. It'll go across borders. That's why it says kings, plural, will shut their mouths at him for what they had not been told. They had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider. So these kings, after this event happens where he sprinkles many nations, then kings are what? Told about it. So the message of what he's done of sprinkling many nations through this activity of sacrifice is going to be spread all the way up to kings of different countries who never heard about it because they didn't have the Old Testament. They just had messengers show up, say, hey, guess what happened? And then they're telling them about who? Well, about Jesus. This completely fits Jesus. And so kings have heard about him. I mean, no story has spread wider and farther than the story of Jesus Christ. More kings haven't heard any other story than this one. So this story spreads all around, even to Gentile kings. And already we have so many points of comparison to Jesus that you can honestly say, who else has done that? Who else does anyone even claim has done these types of things? Well, nobody that I'm aware of. Then in chapter 53, verse 1, it says, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? What we get in chapter 53 is, and it's to my knowledge, it's really the only time that we get this in this whole section, is the response that you're supposed to have to the message, right? Kings will hear something they've never been told about, but what's the real question now is, but who will believe? So the message goes out across lands, but who will believe? This is to me completely profound. Belief is the central issue regarding this sprinkling of nations and this message of grace and forgiveness. Hello, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ right here, not hidden in some special meanings of names, but plainly spelled out in the Old Testament. That blows my mind. It fits Jesus completely. Belief is the central issue of Christianity. Our gospel is what? By faith, you are saved. By faith, just believe, man. Just put your trust in Christ. And what? You will be sprinkled. You will be washed of your sins forever because of what he has done. In other words, this is not a New Testament invention. Some people think that the New Testament Christians hijacked Jesus and hijacked the Old Testament and twisted it to mean what they wanted. You know how some people say you can make the Bible say what you want. Well, maybe you can twist the Bible to try to say what you want, but it still actually has something it actually says. And there are people on earth who care about what it actually says. And I hope that I can count myself as one of them. I actually had a college professor in a logic and critical thinking class when I went to community college briefly. And the professor told me there that he thought Paul the Apostle basically hijacked Christianity and changed it and made it palatable for Gentiles. And that Christianity would have just failed and fizzled out if all it had was Jesus. Because it had Paul, he changed it and took it to make its own. Now, as a Christian, you're like, wait, what? Like, what? Wait, where does it say this? I mean, that's definitely not what the Bible declares. The Bible declares that they went out spreading the gospel all over the place, that it was Jesus himself who commissioned Paul, not the other way around, you know. But one of the reasons why is because they'll say Paul's like really intelligent book, Romans, is a very intelligent book. And he writes detailed story about how we are saved and about how it's by faith and it's through grace, about how Jesus became the substitution for us. He went in our place and he died in our place so that we could be washed clean by his blood, so we could be forgiven, that we then get newness of life. And he just gets into the very detailed, what we call theology, the teaching of the Christian faith. And my college professor thought Paul basically made that stuff up. Well, then how is it that I'm finding it here in Isaiah? Even the part about how we receive it by faith. Who has believed our report? I think it's neat. It's neat. It is really, really neat.